We've all heard about American war crimes in Vietnam, but what the South Vietnamese did in their own country is not as well known. From murdering monks to gunning down civilians, the Republic of Vietnam and its army, ARVN, inflicted suffering on innocent people that has been largely forgotten by history. Join us in this video as we uncover the horrific actions of South Vietnam during and preceding the Vietnam War. If you appreciate videos like this, leave a like and subscribe to A Day in History to keep up to date on future content. Most of us consider the Vietnam War to begin with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, but the conflict actually began in 1955. South Vietnam resisted the Communist North and its insurgencies in the South under the leadership of the controversial US-backed president Diem. Diem was widely seen as corrupt and autocratic, but his Catholic faith and fierce anti-communism was enough for the US to throw their support behind him, at least until one specific crisis shocked the world. Already on high alert for dissent and division, the Diem regime engineered its own demise with its brutal response to the Buddhist Crisis in 1963. Vietnam's Buddhist majority was dissatisfied with Catholic Diem's discriminatory religious policies. Buddhists were passed over for promotion, excluded from high positions in government, were subject to forced labor demands, and could even be placed in concentration camps for causing public unrest. Meanwhile, the tiny Catholic minority was given special privileges. Diem's regime armed Catholic priests in villages as a defense against the Viet Cong, while leaving the Buddhists undefended. Although the communists were no friends to the Buddhists either, many Buddhists went on to join the communist cause in the war simply to escape Diem's persecution. The flashpoint came on 8th of May 1963. Diem's regime had banned the flying of the Buddhist flag on the holy day of Vesak. On that day, in the city of Hue, Diem's forces opened fire on a protesting crowd and killed 9 people. Far from subduing the unrest, the senseless murder of innocent protesters sparked a wave of unrest, which was met with more abominable responses from Diem's regime. On June 3rd, Diem's forces deployed chemical weapons against protesters in Hue, sending almost 70 people to the hospital. But no one embodied the plight of the persecuted Buddhists like Thich Quang Du. On June 11, 1963, Du, a Mahayana Buddhist monk, walked onto a busy intersection in Saigon, ready to make a statement against Diem's regime that history would never forget. Du sat in the traditional lotus position as another monk doused him in gasoline. Then, the monk struck a match and set himself ablaze in the street. The photo of Du's self-immolation remains one of the most famous images in history and irretrievably shattered the reputation of Diem's regime. The regime's response to the global outcry only made things worse. Diem's sister-in-law despised and mocked the Buddhists, saying, "Let them burn and we shall clap our hands." Weeks later, Diem sent Special Forces soldiers to attack dozens of Buddhist pagodas across the country. Hundreds were arrested and many were killed. Religious objects were destroyed, including Du's heart, which was miraculously unburned after his suicide. By this point, Diem's atrocities against his own people had alienated almost all domestic and foreign support. He was finally assassinated by a US-backed coup, led by ARVN officers in November 1973. But although Diem was gone, his actions left many people permanently hostile to the southern government. The North Vietnamese government and Communist China continued to use Diem's brutality against the Buddhists to drum up hostility towards the South and its American allies. With an estimated Buddhist population of 70 to 90%, no small part of Vietnam's population was forever turned against the South because of its crimes against the faith. The Buddhists weren't the only ones mistreated by the South Vietnamese government. Another group that suffered for the war effort were the Montagnards. The Montagnards of the Central Highlands are a diverse range of indigenous peoples who were broadly loyal to the South throughout the war. They were popular with American soldiers and media because of their relatively high rate of Christianity. Furthermore, episodes of savage violence against them by North Vietnamese forces, such as the Dak Son massacre in 1967, which killed hundreds of Montagnards, made them natural opponents of the Communists. Despite this loyalty, the South Vietnamese government frequently mistreated them. One officer reported that Montagnards were usually passed over for promotion in favor of other Vietnamese, while ARVN officers in the field regularly abused Montagnard civilians. ARVN soldiers were known to enter Montagnard villages and steal food. Meanwhile, the military sided with external contractors who exploited the lumber and other raw materials in Montagnard areas, which damaged local communities and angered civilians. If those civilians complained, which happened on more than one occasion, they might be arrested or have their homes and crops burned. Most of the atrocities committed by South Vietnam during the war were done so alongside their American allies. The list of American war crimes in Vietnam is extensive. Check out our video on the My Lai massacre for one example. And often the South Vietnamese were right alongside them. For example, they took part in America's massive Rolling Thunder bombing campaign from 1965 to 1968. Republic of Vietnam Air Force (ARVNAF) bombers flew in the first attacks of Rolling Thunder at Quang He, and in the early months of the operation, they flew dozens of bombing runs over North Vietnam. Although they were eventually sidelined to a small operational area in North Vietnam, the ARVNAF still dropped thousands of bombs on military and civilian targets. Estimates for the death toll in Rolling Thunder go as high as 200,000, most of whom were civilians caught in the crossfire. American-led or not, some of that blood is on South Vietnamese hands. South Vietnam was complicit on the ground too. American units regularly employed interpreters from ARVN, who facilitated or participated in war crimes. One typical example emerges from the US war crime investigations into Tiger Force. Tiger Force was an advanced recon unit whose operations in late 1967 and early 1968 were subject to the largest war crimes investigation in US history. Sometime in late 1967, Tiger Force, with its Vietnamese interpreters, entered a village and encountered a man offering intel in exchange for his family's safety. The man had a wife, a brother, and 2 children, and pleaded with the interpreter to promise him protection. Instead, the interpreter helped the American soldiers beat the man and force him to give up the information immediately. When he refused, they shot him. They would have killed the man's family too, had another American soldier not stepped in and promised to shoot his comrades if they laid a finger on the family. The South Vietnamese interpreter never lifted a finger to protect his fellow Vietnamese, even when they were offering to help. This was a pattern repeated countless times throughout the war. South Vietnam's silence in the face of atrocities such as these was tantamount to complicity. South Vietnam was more active in crimes when it came to the top-secret Operation Phoenix. Known as Phong Hoang to the South Vietnamese, Phoenix was a CIA initiative set up in 1967 to target Viet Cong infrastructure and leadership, which relied mostly on South Vietnamese manpower. Much of its work was on intelligence gathering to inform US and ARVN operations. But Phoenix also operated its own detention centers and operational units. Provisional Reconnaissance Units, PRUs, were made up of South Vietnamese soldiers and were usually led by a member of US Special Forces, like a Navy SEAL or Green Beret. Describing the work of the PRU, a Washington Post reporter said, "The PRU work on the theory of giving back what the Viet Cong deals out, assassination and butchery." Accordingly, a Viet Cong unit on occasion will find the disemboweled remains of its fellows along a well-trod canal bank path, an effective message to guerrillas and to non-committed Vietnamese that too can play the same bloody game. The PRU engaged in sabotage, assassination, and capture missions throughout Vietnam, and earned a grim reputation as one of the deadliest and most brutal forces in the war. Torture, illegal executions, even outright massacres were standard fare. This wasn't helped by the sort of men South Vietnam sent into the PRUs. When the South Vietnamese sent their people, they didn't send their best. Deserters, turncoats, and quote, criminals the South Vietnamese couldn't deal with in prison were among the men sent into the PRU's death squads. One former SEAL named Elton Mancione, who led a PRU unit, said that the arrangement was for these criminals to get a year off their sentence for every communist they killed. Mancione led his Vietnamese squad on several operations and talked about the torture they inflicted. He described one method where they would identify a suspected VC agent and then grab him along with a few other random people, maybe associates, maybe just strangers. Then the PRUs would wrap detonator cords around the necks of the randoms and blow their heads off one by one. By the time you get to your man, Mancione explained, he's talking so fast you got to pop the weasel to shut him up. I guess you could say we wrote the book on terror. The PRUs killed many of their targets, but others had valuable information that the Phoenix program's interrogation centers would brutally extract. Like the PRUs, the interrogation centers were staffed by South Vietnamese soldiers under US supervision. The South Vietnamese unsettled even the CIA with their methods there. The Vietnamese, quote, looked upon torture as a normal and valid method of obtaining intelligence. This meant sexual abuse, electrical shocks, beatings, suspending people from the ceiling on meat hooks, or any other number of crimes against humanity. American witnesses even reported the South Vietnamese torturers using snake bites and dog maulings on prisoners inside the interrogation centers. The US did not officially endorse these methods, but CIA-trained Vietnamese interrogators all came to know the program's unofficial motto: if they are innocent, beat them until they become guilty. The Vietnamese openness to brutality was combined with CIA expertise in it. A US Senate inquiry identified one case where Vietnamese interrogators were directed by CIA observers to use electric shocks, needles driven into fingernails, and iron rods to inflict a range of physical and sexual abuse on a young woman, accused of supporting the communists. Between 1967 and 1972, Phoenix led to the elimination of over 80,000 targets, of which at least 25,000 were killed. Most were killed in US or ARVN operations using Phoenix intel, but thousands were killed by torturers and PRU operatives. Public and congressional scrutiny forced the CIA to wind down the program by 1970, but South Vietnam continued its work under the label Plan F6 until the end of the conflict, although much less effectively than under US oversight. The South was relentless in their imprisonment of suspected enemies, especially after 1970. By 1972, 14,000 people were being arrested every month. Modern scholars estimate that around 80% of these arrests were completely baseless. The abuse of prisoners was systematic and intentional. It was a standard affair for prisoners to be kept completely isolated from each other, especially high-profile ones. The South Vietnamese prisons rarely allowed its captives to leave their cells or walk around the yard. Even a straw mat or blanket to sleep on was only given as a reward for good behavior. Food was poor and only barely enough to keep prisoners alive. There were doctors, but only to keep the prisoners alive so that they could reveal their secrets. One man who experienced the brutalities of South Vietnamese captivity was Nguyen Thai. Thai was no innocent man. He was the most senior North Vietnamese officer ever captured during the war and had operated military, intelligence, and terrorist operations for years, killing hundreds of Americans and South Vietnamese personnel. His capture in December 1970 was completely accidental. He was discovered with false documents by South Vietnamese forces working with Operation Phoenix, and they quickly realized that Thai was no ordinary prisoner. They suspected that he was a spy of some sort, even if they didn't know just how important he really was. The South Vietnamese interrogators set to work breaking him. They used electric shocks, waterboarding, starvation, and beatings to mentally and physically destroy him. His interrogators also used the infamous Chinese water torture method, where they tied him down and dripped water onto his face for days on end, which prevented him from sleeping or eating. In another case, the torturers tied him to the rafters by his arms and left him hanging until his arms popped out of their sockets. How bad was it? Well, when the CIA took Thai away to their own prison in 1972, Thai considered it an improvement. The South Vietnamese had been so bad that Thai confessed to intentionally dragging out his time in CIA captivity, just so he wouldn't have to go back to the South Vietnamese. The Paris Accord of 1973 ensured Thai's protection from torture, as the US withdrew from the country, but Thai remained in South Vietnamese custody up until the end of the war. As communist forces closed in on Saigon in 1975, the South Vietnamese ordered Thai to be executed anyway. His past work and stubbornness in captivity had earned him a lot of hatred. But the order was not carried out before the communists managed to free him. Thai was an unusually high-profile prisoner, and he was no more innocent of torture and violence than his interrogators. But his experience shows that even a man like him was disturbed and terrified of South Vietnamese cruelty. If you're a communist militant and you're relieved to end up in the hands of the CIA, that says a lot about the alternative. Comparatively little information is available on South Vietnamese war crimes. Most material focuses on American or Northern Vietnamese atrocities. Source material on South Vietnamese crimes was probably destroyed during the fall of the government, and the newly unified Vietnam had more incentive to blame Americans for Southern abuses than drag out the divisions in their own country. But nothing can remain buried forever. We can only hope that in time, more information will emerge about what South Vietnam did during the war. It might not bring accountability, but it might bring some closure for the survivors still living with the consequences of one of history's most miserable wars. And if you want to learn more about what went on, check out our other content on Vietnam. Feel free to comment below on other topics you want us to explore, and stay tuned to A Day in History for more insightful videos every week.